Today we're going to read um, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens by Alice Walker. Okay. I described her own nature and temperament, told her they needed a larger life for their expression. I pointed out that, in lieu of proper channels, her emotions had overflowed into paths that dissipated them. I talked beautifully, I thought, about an art that would be born, an art that would open the way for women the likes of her. I asked her to hope and build up an inner life against the coming of that day. I sang, with a strange quiver in my voice, a promise song. A.V. Jean Toomer, Cain, the poet speaking to a prostitute who falls asleep while he's talking. When the poet Jean Toomer walked through the South in the early 20s, he discovered a curious thing. Black women whose spirituality was so intense, so deep, so unconscious, they were themselves unaware of the richness they held. They stumbled blindly through their lives, creatures so abused and mutilated in body, so dimmed and confused by pain, that they considered themselves unworthy even of hope. In the selfless abstractions their bodies became to the men who used them. They became more than sexual objects, more even than mere women. They became saints. Instead of being perceived as whole persons, their bodies became shrines. What was thought to be their minds became temples suitable for worship. These crazy saints stared at the world widely like lunatics, or quietly like suicides, and the god that was in their gaze was as mute as a great stone. Who were these saints? These crazy, loony, pitiful women? Some of them, without a doubt, were our mothers and grandmothers. In the still heat of the post-Reconstruction South, this is how they seemed to Jean Toomer. Exquisite butterflies trapped in an evil honey, toiling away their lives in an era, a century, that did not acknowledge them, even as the meal of the world. They dreamed dreams that no one knew, not even themselves, in any coherent fashion, and saw visions no one could understand. They wandered or sat about the countryside, crooning lullabies to ghosts and drawing the Mother of Christ in charcoal on on courthouse walls. They forced their minds to desert their bodies, and their striving spirits sought to rise, like frail whirlwinds from the hard red clay. And when those frail whirlwinds fell and scattered particles upon the ground, no one mourned. Instead, men lit candles to celebrate the emptiness that remained, as people do who enter a beautiful but vacant space to resurrect a god. Our mothers and grandmothers, some of them, moving to music not yet written, and they waited. They waited for a day when the unknown thing that was in them would be made known, but guessed somehow, in their darkness, that one day of their revelation they would be long dead. Therefore to Toomer they walked, and even ran in slow motion, for they were going nowhere intimate, immediate, and their future was not yet within their grasp. And men took our mothers and grandmothers, but got no pleasure from it. So complex was their passion and their calm. To Toomer they lay vacant and fallow as autumn fields, with harvest time never in sight, and he saw them enter loveless marriages without joy, and became prostitutes without resistance, and became mothers of children without fulfillment. For these grandmothers and mothers of ours were not saints, but artists, driven to a numb and bleeding madness by the springs of creativity in them for which there was no release. They were creators who lived lives of spiritual waste, because they were so rich in spirituality, which is the basis of art, that the strain of enduring their unused and unwanted talents drove them insane. Throwing away the spirituality was their pathetic attempt to lighten the soul to a weight their work-worn, sexually abused bodies could bear. What did it mean for a black woman to be an artist in our grandmother's time, in our great-grandmother's day? It is a question with an answer cruel enough to stop the blood. Did you have a genius of a great-grandmother who died under some ignorant and depraved white overseas lash? Or was she required to bake biscuits for a lazy backwater tramp when she cried out in her soul to paint watercolors of sunsets, or the rain falling on the green and peaceful pasture lands? Or was her body broken and forced to bear children, who were more often than not sold away from her? 8, 10, 15, 20 children, when her one joy was the thought of modeling heroic figures of rebellion in stone or clay. How was the creativity of the black woman kept alive, year after year, and century after century? When most of the years black people have been in America, it was a punishable crime for a black person to read or write. And the freedom to paint, to sculpt, to expand the mind when action did not exist. Consider, if you can bear to imagine it, what might have been the result if singing, too, had been forbidden by law. Listen to the voices of Bessie Smith, Billie Holiday, Nina Simone, Roberta Flack, and Aretha Franklin, among others, and imagine those voices muzzled for life. Then you may begin to comprehend the lives of our crazy, sainted mothers and grandmothers, the agony of the lives of women who might have been poets, novelists, essayists, and short story writers over a period of centuries, who died with their real gifts stifled within them. And if this were the end of the story, we would have cause to cry out in my paraphrase of Okot P. Pictet's great poem. O my clanswoman, let us all cry together. Come, let us mourn the death of our mother, death of a queen, the ash that was produced by a great fire. Oh, this homestead is utterly dead. Close the gates with lacquery thorns, for our mother, the creator of the stool, is lost, and all the young men have perished in the wilderness. But this is not the end of the story, for all the young women, our mothers and grandmothers, ourselves, have not perished in the wilderness. And if we ask ourselves why, and search for and find the answer, we will know beyond all efforts to erase it from our minds just exactly who and of what we black American women are. One example, perhaps the most pathetic, most misunderstood one, can provide a backdrop for our mother's work. Phyllis Wheatley, a slave in the 1700s. Virginia Woolf, in her book A Room of One's Own, wrote that in order for a woman to write fiction, she must have two things, certainly: a room of her own, with key and lock, and enough money to support herself. What then are we to make of Phyllis Wheatley, a slave who owned not even herself? The sickly, frail black girl who required a servant of her own at times. Her health was so precarious, and who, had she been white, would have been easily considered the intellectual superior of all the women and most of the men in the society of her day. Virginia Woolf wrote further, speaking of course not of our Phyllis, that any woman born with a great gift in the 16th century, insert 18th century, insert black woman, insert born or made a slave, would certainly have gone crazed, shot herself, or ended her days in some lonely cottage outside the village, half witch, half wizard, insert saint, feared and mocked at. For it needs little skill and psychology to be sure that a highly gifted girl who had tried to use her gift of poetry would have been so thwarted and hindered by contrary instincts, chains, guns, the ownership of one's body by someone else, submission to an alien religion, that she must have lost her health and sanity to a certainty. The key words, as they relate to Phyllis, are contrary instincts. For when we read the poetry of Phyllis Wheatley, as when we read the novels of Nella Larson or the oddly false-sounding autobiography of that freest of all black women writers, Zora Hurston, evidence of contrary instincts is everywhere. Her loyalties were completely divided, as was, without question, her mind. But how could this be otherwise? Captured at 7, a slave of wealthy, doting whites who instilled in her the savagery of the Africa they rescued her from. One wonders if she was even able to remember her homeland as she had known it, or as it really was. Yet, because they did try to use her gift for poetry in a world that made her a slave, she was so thwarted and hindered by contrary instincts that she, lost her health. In the last years of her brief life, burdened not only with the need to express her gift, but also a penniless, friendless freedom, and several small children for whom she was forced to do strenuous work to feed, she lost her health, certainly, suffering from malnutrition and neglect, and who knows what mental agonies, Phyllis Wheatley died. So torn by contrary instincts was black, kidnapped, enslaved Phyllis that her description of the goddess, as she poetically called the liberty she did not have, is ironically, cruelly humorous, and in fact has held Phyllis up to ridicule for more than a century. It is usually read prior to hanging Phyllis' memory as that of a fool. She wrote, "The goddess came, the goddess comes, she moves divinely fair, olive and laurel binds her golden hair. Wherever shines is native of the skies, unnumbered charms and recent graces rise." It is obvious that Phyllis, the slave, combined the goddess's hair every morning, prior perhaps to bringing in the milk or fixing her mistress's lunch. She took her imagery from the one thing she saw elevated above all others. With the benefit of hindsight, we ask, how could she? But at last, Phillies, we understand. No more snickering when your stiff, struggling, ambivalent lines are forced on us. We know that you were not an idiot or a traitor, only a sickly little black girl, snatched from your home and country and made a slave, a woman who still struggled to sing the song that was your gift, although in the land of barbarians who praised you for your bewildered tongue. It is not so much what you sing as that you kept alive in so many of our ancestors, the notion of song. Black women are called, in the folklore that so aptly identifies one's status in society, the mule of the world, because we have been handled the burdens that everyone else refused to carry. We have also been called matriarchs, superwomen, and mean and evil bitches, not to mention castrators and Sapphire's mama. When we have pleaded for understanding, our character has been distorted. When we have asked for simple caring, we have been handled empty inspirational appellations, then stuck in the farthest corner. When we have asked for love, we have been given children. In short, even our plainer gifts, our labors of fealty and love, have been knocked down our throats. To be an artist and a black woman, even today, lowers our status in so many respects, rather than raises it. And yet artists we will be. Therefore, we must fearlessly pull out of ourselves and look at and identify with our lives the living creativity some of our great-grandmothers were not allowed to know. I stress some of them, because it is well known that the majority of our great-grandmothers knew, even without knowing it, the reality of their spirituality, even if they didn't recognize it beyond what happened in the singing at church, and they never had any intention of giving it up. How they did it, those millions of black women who were not Phyllis Wheatley, or Lucy Terry, or Frances Harper, or Zora Hurston, or Nella Larson, or Bessie Smith, or Elizabeth Catlett, or Catherine Dunham, either brings me to the title of this essay, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, which is a personal account that is yet shared in its theme and its meaning by all of us. I found, while thinking about the far-reaching world of the creative black woman, that often the truest answer to a question that really matters can be found very close. In the late 1920s, my mother ran away from home to marry my mother. Marriage, if not running away, was expected of 17-year-old girls. By the time she was 20, she had 2 children and was pregnant with a third. 5 years later, I was born. And this is how I came to know my mother. She seemed a large, soft, loving-eyed woman who was rarely impatient in our home. Her quick, violent temper was on view only a few times a year, when she battled with the white landlord who had the misfortune to suggest to her that her children did not need to go to school. She made all the clothes we wore, even my brother's overalls. She made all the towels and sheets we used. She spent the summers canning vegetables and fruits. She spent the winter evenings making quilts enough to cover all our beds. During the working day, she labored beside, not behind, my father in the fields. Her day began before sun up, and did not end until late at night. There was never a moment for her to sit down, undisturbed, to unravel her own private thoughts. Never a time free from interruption. My work was a noisy increase of her many children. And yet it is to my mother, and all our mothers who were not famous, that I went in search of the secret of what has fed that muzzled and was often mutilated, but vibrant, creative spirit that the black woman has inherited, and that pops out in wild and unlikely places to this day. But when, you will ask, did my overworked mother have time to know or care about feeding the creative spirit? The answer is so simple that many of us have spent years discovering it. We have constantly looked high when we should have looked high and low. For example, in the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., there hangs a quilt unlike any other in the world. In fanciful, inspired, and yet simple and identifiable figures, it portrays the story of the crucifixion. It is considered rare, beyond price, though it follows no known pattern of quilt making, and though it is made of bits and pieces of worthless rags. It is obviously the work of a person of powerful imagination and deep spiritual feeling. Below this quilt I saw a note that says it was made by an anonymous black woman in Alabama 100 years ago. If we could locate this anonymous black woman from Alabama, she would turn out to be one of our grandmothers, an artist who left her mark in the only materials she could afford, and in the only medium her position in society allowed her to use. As Virginia Woolf wrote further in A Room of One's Own, yet genius of a sort must have existed among women as it must have existed among the working class. Change this to slaves and the wives and daughters of sharecroppers. Now and again, an Emily Bronte or Robert Burns, change this to Zora Hurston or Richard Wright, blazes out and proves its presence. But certainly it never got itself onto paper. When, however, one reads of a witch being ducked, of a woman possessed by devils or sainthood, of a wise woman selling herbs for root workers, or even a very remarkable man who had a mother, then I think we are on the track of a lost novelist, a suppressed poet, or some mute and inglorious Jane Austen. Indeed, I would venture to guess that Anon, who wrote so many poems without signing them, was often a woman. And so our mothers and grandmothers have, more often than not, anonymously handed on the creative spark, the seed of the flower they themselves never hoped to see, or like a sealed letter they could not plainly read. And so it is, certainly, with my own mother. Unlike Ma, Rainey's songs, we retain their creator's name, even while blasting forth from Jessie Smith's mouth. No song or poem will bear my mother's name. Yet so many of the stories that I write, that we all write, are my mother's stories. Only recently did I fully realize this, that through years of listening to my mother's stories of her life, I have absorbed not only the stories themselves, but something of the manner in which she spoke, something of the urgency that involves the knowledge that her stories, like her life, must be recorded. It is probably for this reason that so much of what I have written is about characters whose counterparts in real life are so much older than I am. But the telling of these stories, which came from my mother's lips as naturally as breathing, was not the only way our mother showed herself as an artist. For stories too were subject to being distracted, to dying without conclusion. Dinners must be started, and cotton must be gathered before the big rains. The artist that was and is my mother. showed itself to me only after many years. This is what I finally noticed. Like Mem, a character in The Third Life of Grange Copeland, my mother adorned with flowers whatever shabby house we were forced to live in. Not just your typical straggly country stand of zinnias either. She planted ambitious gardens, and still does, with over 50 different variants of plants that bloom profusely from early March until late November. Before she left home for the field, she watered her flowers, chopped up the grass, and laid out new beds. When she returned from the field, she might divide clumps of bulbs, dig a cold pit, uproot and replant roses, or prune branches from her larger bushes or trees, until night came and it was too dark to see. Whatever she planted grew as if by magic, and her fame as a group of as a grower of flowers spread over three countries. Because of her creativity with her flowers, even my memory of poverty are seen through a screen of blooms, sunflowers, petunias, roses, dahlias, forsythias, spirea, delphin, delphiniums, verbena, and so on. And I remember people coming to my mother's yard to be given cuttings from her flowers. I hear again the praise showered on her because whatever rocky soil she rammed it on, she turned into a garden. The garden was so beautiful with colors, so original in its design, so magnificent with life and creativity, that to this day people drive by our house in Georgia, perfect strangers and imperfect strangers, and ask to stand or walk among my mother's art. I notice that it is only when my mother is working in her flowers that she is radiant, almost to the point of being invisible, excerpt as creator, hand and eye. She is involved in work her soul must have, ordering the universe in the image of that personal conception of beauty. Her face, as she prepares the art that is her gift, is a legacy of respect she leaves to me, for all that illuminates and cherishes life. She has handed down respect for the possibilities, and the will to grasp them. For her, so hindered and intruded upon in so many ways, being an artist has still been a daily part of her life. This ability to hold on, even in very simple ways, is worth black women have done for a very long time. This poem is not long enough, but it is something, for the woman who literally covered the holes in our walls with sunflowers. There was a woman then, my mama's generation, husky of voice, stout of step, with fists as well as hands. How they battered down doors, and ironed starched white shirts. How they led armies, head-ragged generals among mined fields, booby-trapped kitchens to discover books, desks, a place for us. How they knew what we must know, without knowing a page of it themselves. Guided by my heritage of a love of beauty and the respect for strength, in search of my mother's garden, I found my own. And perhaps in Africa over 200 years ago, there was just such a mother. Perhaps she painted vivid and daring decorations in oranges and yellows and greens on the walls of her hut. Perhaps she sang in a voice like Roberta Flack's, sweetly over the compounds of her village. Perhaps she wove the most stunning mats or told the most ingenious stories of all the village storytellers. Perhaps she was herself a poet, though only her daughter's name is signed to the poems that we know. Perhaps Phyllis Wheatley's mother was also an artist. Perhaps in more than Phyllis Wheatley's biological life is her mother's signature made clear. And that was Walker's In Search of Her Mother's Garden.